Hey everyone, so excited that you are here today to be part of kind of a new workshop series that the emPowered PR Group is providing. It's called an emPowered Author Workshop. This is a complimentary monthly webinar that the emPowered PR Group is bringing and providing to any and all nonfiction authors who are interested in learning some new and interesting, innovative, kind of unique marketing strategies and tactics to help them promote and sell their books to those who need them and want them. So my name is Stephanie Feger, if we don't know each other yet. I am the owner and chief strategist of the emPowered PR Group. And today I'm joined by Betsy Wallace. She's the owner of Capsule Podcast. Hey, Betsy.
Hey, Stephanie, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be a part of your workshop series.
Yay, me too. And for those who haven't listened, Betsy and I have a whole series in the emPowered Author podcast where we got to dive deep into this topic. And I had so much fun, not only getting the chance to do that with you, but meeting you, learning all of the great things that you bring to the table and everything about your business. And we've met in person, which is super cool too.
Yeah.
I love when life allows that to happen.
Yeah.
So before we dive in, we're going to go super deep in podcast today. Before we do, if you're new to this and you're new to what Empower PR Group's all about, I just want to take a quick second on the front end so that you don't have to wait till the end to get this info and just let you know how the emPowered PR Group helps people, and specifically how we help people on this particular topic and how these workshops are helping to help people. So, and then we'll dive into a little bit about what Betsy does. Then we'll go to all things podcast. So the emPowered PR Group is a kind of a boutique PR agency that helps nonfiction authors do three things. They help them write books that sell, promote their books to those who need them, want them, and will buy them. That's the interesting little add-on. And it also helps authorpreneurs, those individuals who are building businesses from their meaningful messages. So we help them do that through unique marketing strategies and tactics. And we love to collaborate with industry experts, much like you, Betsy, to kind of merge this marketing strategic approach with the tactical elements of how to actually accomplish that. And our goal at the end is to just merely help you, the nonfiction author, achieve your goals. That's, if there's nothing else we could do and walk away feeling good about, it's that we want you to feel like you are able to achieve whatever your goal was in the space of spreading the word about your book. So each month, the emPowered PR Group hosts these kind of complimentary workshops, really meant to empower you with your book marketing success. So we're going to dive deep into different marketing strategies that are innovative, kind of, some might be edgy, some might be kind of new and fresh, some might be things that they've done in the past that we need to kind of revamp and relook at. But at the end of the day, the goal is to help you be able to start either implementing them today or realize that you have a team in your back door or right here virtually that can help you accomplish what you need done. So I am going to be dropping a link here in the chat. I'll also put it in the description for those who are watching this on replay later. So you can learn more about how the emPowered PR Group specifically helps people who are interested in podcasting or being a podcast guest. We have the ability to help you on both. And that takes us to today's topic, podcasts, how to use them, how to pitch them, how to leverage them. So those three things we're going to be talking about today. And, I love podcasts for lots of reasons, Betsy. As you know, I love them because I think in today's kind of 24-hour news cycle, podcasts give you a break to get away from all the hustle and bustle and noise and really focus on what you're interested in and how that can really help move the marble. I also am a big believer and love hosting podcasts. We'll talk about that later too. So before we go any farther, though, Betsy, I want you to take a moment and share with everybody kind of your background, how you came to this, and what you bring to this conversation.
Sure. Thanks for having me. So I am both a podcast producer and a podcast host. So my journey started in podcasting in 2018, and I co-host a show with my sister called The Dinner Sisters, and we cook and review 3 recipes a week, and then share with our listeners how it went. So I have 3 kids, my sister is single, and we make the same recipe and then talk about it together. And that show has really grown. We always joke that it started with the 10 women from our mom's water aerobics class at the YMCA, and then it has just kind of snowballed from there. And right now we have maybe 10 to 15,000 people a month listening to what we had for dinner, which is fantastic. We've got a great Facebook community where we talk about the recipes we tried every week. So after doing that, we're coming up almost on 4 years this spring. So doing that and getting all the experience and having all the fun with podcasting, and then really going deep into what is the future of podcasting, how are brands using podcasting, all of that stuff sort of dovetailed with my previous experience. And I got really excited about the marketing opportunities for people within podcasting. And you know this too, it's just a really fun way to add to your marketing strategy.
Really?
Because it just gives you a way to add content that maybe is just not writing heavy. It's not photography heavy. It just lets you use some different kind of headspace and different skills and gets you kind of out there a little bit more and developing yourself as a person, which I think is really cool and important. So capsule podcasts really are 6 episodes. And I like to, and that's the production and teaching learning company that I have. And we teach a framework where people start with 6 episodes first, so that we're not just diving into a weekly show and then you're really setting yourself up for failure, I think, because you don't have a way to kind of get off the train if maybe it's something that's not great for you. So if we start with 6 episodes, we can do multiple series, which is what you have done, right? Like,
yes,
you just theme those, but it always gives you like this off ramp and an on ramp to kind of use podcasting in a way that's smart for you, in a way that's smart for your business, in a way that's smart for your lifestyle, and just gives you a nice framework to get a taste of it, because it's so fun and I want more people to do it.
Yeah, it helps me realize that in a world that could be overwhelming, it doesn't have to be. And so it gives me parameters too, Betsy. I love that too. As someone who, if anybody does the Colby kind of personality or business test to kind of figure out how you work, I'm a quick start. And as a quick start means I have 1,000 ideas. What I love about the Capsule podcast is like, Stephanie, you get 6. Focus on 6, and if we need to do more, that's a whole nother episode or another season rather. But 6 just feels good and nice and tight. And we'll definitely talk about how we can use the capsule podcast concept in our 3rd bucket for the day when we talk about how to leverage podcasts, because Betsy and I did 6 episodes. If you've not listened to it yet, definitely you should. We'll link to that also in the description. But taking a deep dive on how nonfiction authors can really utilize these specifically to make that happen. And so I'm so pumped today. And what I've realized, Betsy, is the 2 of us together, we have something interesting to share with nonfiction authors. Not only do we know the power of what podcasts can do as podcast hosts, we also know what it's like to be on podcasts as guests. And we also know what it feels like when people try to pitch us to be on our podcasts.
Yeah. So
we have kind of this ability to dabble in both, and we get to help nonfiction authors figure out between all of that how they can, how they can stick out amongst the crowd and kind of be seen as thought leaders without being in a way that to help them achieve their goals. So that's what we're talking about today. I'm really pumped, and I'm so glad you're here for us to kind of dig in. So are you ready? Let's start with the first part. You ready?
I'm ready. Let's go. Let's do
it. Okay. So number 1, we all know what a podcast is. So we're not going to go down that path. If you don't, then that's a whole nother podcast season we should do, right? And it's a new way that people are getting information. But let's talk about, how do you find podcasts? And when I mention how do you find podcasts, I'm not talking about merely as a listener, but as a nonfiction author that's coming to the table, realizing you have a book that's about to come out or that has come out, or you have a message to share. How do you find a podcast that is worthy of you pitching? And this is something that, you can pay other people to help find for you if that's something that intrigues you. But the reality is you kind of hold the opportunity to also navigate that. Podcasts have more flexibility than earned media or TV, the traditional media outlets where it's a little untraditional for non-traditional rather, for if you're not a PR person, to reach out to editors, right? But in the podcast world, like, they expect to hear directly from guests sometimes. So let's talk a little bit about how people can find podcasts. And, Betsy, I have to start, and you know this about me, I always start with the strategy. First and foremost, like, you have to know who your target audience is, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you can figure out who your target audience is, and what I mean by that with your book, so take a step back, think about your book, think about your message, think about who needs that message. That is your target audience. And they could have a couple different personas, but that individual, that group of people, where do they get information on the podcast platforms? What type of information are they consuming, and how do they consume it? I'll use me as an example. My book is for really targeted for kind of busy women, and many of it kind of speaks to the mom space. And listen, and Betsy, I know you get this. Like, I don't have time to always read stuff, even though I do love to read books. So that's a lie a little bit. But when I'm on the go and consuming information in this way, I want to listen to a podcast because I could do it in the car. I could do it while I'm getting ready in the morning. I can do it when I'm working on our farm, whatever. I can be consuming information in that way. So I would say start with knowing your target audience, and then start digging into how do podcasts align with that? What do you think about that? Is there anything I'm missing there?
Yeah, I have a good example from a friend I was talking to recently, and she has a business where it's a platform for people who have adopted kids and are struggling with the adoption process.
Yep.
And we were talking about guesting and how that moves the needle on your podcast, and just in general,
Yep.
Getting more people into your community, because she had this great opportunity to go on a podcast, and they had asked her to come on, and it was a business moms podcast. And she said, this is a really big podcast in this space. It's super well respected. She was thrilled to be asked. And she said, you know what, though? This is not going to move the needle in my business, because if I go on like the Richmond Moms Adoption podcast that only has 200 people tuning in a week, those people need exactly what I'm offering through my consulting and coaching purposes. And she said, and those people are looking for answers, and they are looking for someone to help solve their problems. And I can be a huge help and bring a lot of value to that audience. And she was like talking to a giant platform this podcast is 100,000 downloads a week, but she said, those are online business owners. How many of those people are, adoptive parents? Probably not that many. And she said, and I know from experience, just going for large numbers like that doesn't necessarily move the needle in my business. But if I can find these really small independent podcasts who are speaking to, even if it's 50 people who are tuning in, that's like the gold. And I thought it's such a powerful illustration because of the power of podcasting and finding your small audiences like that.
I am a believer that, someone coined it before, riches in the niches. It's truth. That's truth for real. If you can niche down to really the people who need you, even like you said, even if it's a smaller group, you're going to have a higher ROI. It's going to be more worth your time than just doing this kind of blanket outreach. I love that. That's a great example. I love that. So how do you find those? How do you find those groups? Well, here's a couple of ideas. One of my favorites, it's kind of a new favorite that I have, Betsy, is joining some groups out there where hosts are looking for guests. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that can be a red flag. Sometimes it doesn't have to be. Sometimes to me, that's a red flag that is the podcast too new and they don't have a lot of followers. Maybe they're, maybe that's something to consider. So you could ask some questions like, what's your viewership or listenership and what have you. But other times that's not accurate at all. It just has to be that they are a niche, podcast and are looking for the right people. So Facebook has one, it's called Be a Guest, Find a Guest. And I have found some really, really good podcast opportunities there. And so I would go looking on some social platforms, Facebook and LinkedIn probably specifically, where they're seeking podcast guests, and podcast hosts can go on there and openly say, this is the types of things that I'm looking for. Would you be of interest? I was just on a podcast last week. For my book, it was focused on the Christian audience space. It was the perfect podcast for me. It was phenomenal because me and the host like just jammed really well. But she found me, I found her on one of those Facebook groups. So that's always something to consider. Another thing, speaking of LinkedIn, I love LinkedIn. So if as author, nonfiction author, hear me right now. If you're not on LinkedIn and don't have, even if it's just a beautiful LinkedIn profile, you're missing out. But I think that LinkedIn is a great place to also have conversations with podcast hosts. Most podcast hosts are really proud to acknowledge that they are a podcast host. So you can search specific types of podcast hosts. I would always put host in there because that's what you're looking for. You're trying to build a connection with a host. But you could even do like search leadership podcast host, something like that in the search bar in LinkedIn. Or if you want to go deeper, Christian podcast host, for instance, on some of my Christian authors I work with, or crisis management podcast host, right? You can go pretty deep and then search on the people section, and you will see people who acknowledge this is the podcast that I am hosting, and this is how it meets that need. Open up with those direct messages and get those conversations going. People love it. And I've gotten actually a lot of podcast placement for many of my clients through that way.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to do it too, because it's a little bit better than a cold email, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because someone can click right over and see your profile and realize that you're kind of making a legit ask, and you're not just, as a podcast host, this, you get a lot of kind of spammy looking stuff in your email box, and it can be easy. You do. Yeah. And it can be easy just to dismiss all of that because you just don't want to. So sending that LinkedIn message is a way to kind of personalize that ask that gives you the immediate credibility on that platform.
Instagram's another great platform to do that on too. And I think that my big tip here is you don't want to be spammy. So if you're spammy, like even if you're legit, they're going to shut down. They are not interested. I actually told someone on LinkedIn today, stop spamming me, and this wasn't for the podcast, but it was for something else. Like, I'm done, stop. You don't want the podcast host to get to that place. So be meaningful and authentic. Like, do your research, find out more about the podcast. Listen to the podcast, even if it's just one episode or two, and make sure that it's a really, really good fit. But Instagram is another great platform to do that. It really, if they acknowledge themselves as a podcast host there, that might be a good selection. I think another place to find some really good podcasts to consider is utilizing a podcast platform that hosts utilize too. So there's a couple that I like. Podcast Guests is one. Or podcastguest.com. Podmatch is another. Someone shared with me about Podbooker. I'm not familiar with that one directly, but I know that they say that's a really good one. And these are platforms that are meant to connect the host and the guest together. I know podcastguest.com sends daily emails where podcast hosts actually pay to have their podcast highlighted, and it gets pushed through to all of these people who are podcast guest experts. I have gotten several podcast interviews through that platform, and they're pretty good. Personally, if you're going to invest in being on that platform, then they're legit. They are good ones to consider. But as a guest, you don't have to pay to be a part of that. So if any of those, so those could also be good too. So I know, Betsy, you had a really cool idea for like a quick hack here. I think you should share it. It was a really good idea.
Yeah, an easy way to kind of do a little reverse engineering on podcast guesting is to look for someone who has a book, maybe in a similar target niche as you do, and go see where they have guested. So you can see, like, I know I have a book really similar to Stephanie's, and so let me go see all the ones that she's been on. And then I'm going to go back and research those shows and see if I can pitch that guest and, or pitch that host to be a guest. And, some hosts will even have on their webpage, there'll be a form you can fill out, like a Google form or something that will say apply to be a guest. And it never hurts, especially if they have that on their website, to go ahead and go do it that way and just follow their process and their directions. Or just pitch them directly if they don't have anything like that on their website. But then they are looking for people like you because you have kind of reverse engineered that process a little bit.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that even if you don't pitch the exact same ones, the other thing that you can find is what are the types of podcasts
Mhm.
that author is going to be on. So you might notice that there's some podcasts that are great platforms just for authors in general. I believe it's Author Radio. I'll have to do some research, but there's a fantastic podcast that many of my authors have been on in the past that is just good for any author. It's just a great author platform. And then you'll find that others are really niched down to the specific genre target audience. And that's going to get your brain thinking, how can I do that? I love that. That was a great hack. Love it. Love it, love it, love it. So we'll have some time at the end for questions. So anybody that's listening in, hang tight. We can answer those at the end. But I think, Betsy, you've already kind of opened the door. Let's pivot over to how to pitch. How do
Sure.
you pitch podcasts? And how do you really use those podcasts effectively? Because there's nothing worse to me than seeing an amazing author out there who pitched a great podcast, got on it, did the podcast, and did not leverage it at all. And then it's like, oh, you've missed out on so many great things. So here's some tips. Again, starting with the strategy first. I want you to ask yourself, why are you even doing this? What's your goal for accomplishing? What is your goal to accomplish with this podcast anyways? Like, how is being a guest on a podcast going to help you achieve your goal? Are you looking to increase book sales? Are you looking to increase your brand awareness or visibility? Do you see your book as a calling card to open doors for relationships? That's an interesting reason why you might pitch a podcast, because it could be that the podcast listeners are your target audience to buy a product of yours, not even your book or service of yours. Are you looking for podcasts as a platform to help you grow your business? And being a guest on podcasts is going to help you do that. You need to ask yourself these questions, because there's nothing worse than getting on a podcast that you are guesting on and having no clue really what you're going to say. Sure, you might have, the hook might have been that your book and your message might have gotten you in, but you get to control what you're going to get out of it. What do you think, Betsy? Am I missing something there? What would there be another reason you think that someone might want to consider guesting?
Yeah, I think you are right that you have to know what you're going to be on there for. And most of the time the host, that is a good thing for the host to know also. Like on the Dinner Sisters, we have cookbook authors come through quite a bit. And I've had a handful of times, a publicist who is from a agency we work with. So we like to work with them. So we put their guests on usually because we have a relationship. And in our, like a pre-chat, I'll say, so what, where can people find your book? What's your book about? And they'll be like, oh, I'm just doing podcast interviews. I'm like, I mean,
oh my gosh.
So help me out a little bit here. Like, if that's your answer, then I'm not sure why you are on my podcast. And then it makes it more difficult for me as the host to try to, then I need to come up with some sort of arc for this interview.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely not the expert at your book or the thing that I don't know what you want out of this episode. I can
help me, help you, help me.
Yes. And it's really, as the guest going on, it makes the host's job so much easier if we know why you're there. And I don't think you should be, I think there's a fine line between like selling and promoting and just it providing no value, because that's not good either. But if you're on there and you're being so shy, or you're just like, no, I don't want to, like, don't self-promote, I'm just going to be here to talk, that's not helpful to the host either.
No. Well, no. And that actually takes us to number 2. You want to make it easy for the host.
Yeah.
Listen, like Betsy and I know this because we our podcast hosts ourselves. Podcasting is not easy on the back end. Like, it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of planning, prep, a lot of time. It's an investment, all that stuff. So if somebody is taking time to allow you to be on their podcast, make it easy for them, because everything else is not easy or time consuming. So coming to the table, kind of knowing why you wanted to be in a podcast. Is it to sell books? Is it to direct people to somewhere else? Like, what is it? And making sure that the podcast host knows that is kind of important. Kind of important. I also think you need to be in making it easy for the host before you pitch. Like, I've mentioned it before, but take a listen to the podcast. My favorite, Betsy, is when people reach out to me and say, I think I would be a great guest. And I'm like, you didn't listen to my podcast. I don't take guests. Like, my podcast strategy is not around that.
Yeah.
I'll have guests, but they're hand selected on my end, meant to help you, the nonfiction author. It's not the other way around. So yeah, that is an immediate turn off on my end. So I'm like, no, you have no idea who I am and what I'm doing. And I think everybody needs to take a moment and listen to the podcast. Speaking of which, I love your podcast, and I have learned so much about cooking, and I've really enjoyed it. So I just want you to know that. I know I've told you before, but I want to do a little plug for it here because it's really great. I have so much fun listening.
Thanks. Yeah, I think especially it also helps. I've gotten a lot of the most useful pitches we get are people who will say, I can speak on, here are 3 topics that I could speak on. And there's a little bit of diversity in the topics there. Mm-hmm. So for instance, I just recorded something today. We did an intro because we had a guest on, and he has a product that's in the freezer aisle, and it's more of a brand partnership. And so the publicist, though, sent over a list of things he could talk about. And one was plant-based eating. Another was flash frozen versus slow freezing and the difference between the quality and like for home cooks. And then the third one was being a founder of a food and beverage startup. And so those were 3 very different topics that, I mean, kind of 2 were more relevant to my podcast and the third one wasn't, but I appreciate having those just some ideas where I can say, yeah, we would have him on. And we talked about the flash frozen thing. So that was, I thought, that actually would be interesting for my audience. And that helped me make that decision and kind of know where we were going with this, and and it goes a little bit deeper too, than to say like, I have this book about X and I have these 3 topics I could speak on. And then I kind of know how I might package that episode up, which is really useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I took a note on that because I'm like, that's brilliant. I love how you just acknowledge that, and the diversity in those shows kind of your depth and breadth on why you wrote a book or why you're doing what you're doing and how you can talk about all of these. And should the host have a need for you to talk about something different, they'll ask you. So rest assured, they will come back to the table and go, okay, these are awesome, but would you talk on this? And you might be able to say, absolutely. I think 3 is always manageable and not overwhelming for anybody, and having some variety there, I think, is really great. The other thing is you're thinking about what topics you might want to pitch and how you can make it easy for the host. I would encourage you to realize this. So we just talked about how hard it is to kind of navigate podcasting, and I don't mean hard as in hard, but it's time consuming. It's an investment that the host is doing. There is a reason that the host has a podcast. Like, I'm just gonna pull the curtain back, Betsy. There's a reason that the host has a podcast.
Yeah.
I want you to reflect on what those reasons could be. It could be that it's a revenue generator for them. Maybe they sell ads or have sponsors. Maybe it is a visibility platform for them and where they want to go. Maybe it's an opportunity to open doors to new forms of service business. Honestly, that's what the emPowered Authors goal is for my podcast. So understanding that will help you realize, all right, I know that they have a goal, or they wouldn't be, or a purpose, or even a financial goal, or they wouldn't be investing so much time and energy into it. So if I know what that is, and I know it relates to who their listeners are, how can I help them deepen their listener engagement? That's really good to think about. So, I think about that when I'm pitching authors specifically. And that helps you determine what are those three topics. So sure, your goal might be to sell the book, but the reality is their listeners might be looking for something else. You provide a solution for the listener. The listener then gets excited to not only listen to that podcast ongoing, but now they want to buy your book because you have reached them in a way of why they're already tuning into that podcast.
Yeah, it's definitely it needs to be a win-win situation. So figuring out what makes that win-win
Yeah.
is the sweet spot you're trying to hit there.
Well, and then following up and telling the podcast host, hey, guess what? I will also promote this. I laugh at this because for podcasts, right? For them to get their listenership and to get ads or sponsors, they need so many people to watch the podcast. So when you promote it on your platform, you are helping them extend their reach and they're promoting it on their platform. So they're helping you extend their reach. It's just a win-win.
And it is interesting too. I wouldn't take for granted, like, don't assume that the host knows that you're going to do that. Because one of the biggest things I hear from podcast hosts is a frustration that their guests are not cross promoting. And I've even seen in chat, like online Facebook group chats and things like that, like, can I make my guests sign a contract that they will cross promote? Because people get really frustrated because you're like, okay, I gave you this platform and we had this conversation. And the way I'm trying to grow my show, especially if it's someone who's trying to grow their show, is through this cross promotion strategy, and like, take it or leave it on whether or not you think that's a good idea.
Right.
I absolutely do not think you should lock people into contracts. And it's just more of a goodwill between the host and the guest. And it helps strengthen that network and that relationship for further down the road. Right.
Yeah.
But letting that podcast host know that you intend to promote it. And then once you have promoted, just, send them a quick email and say, thanks again. And I promoted it, will go a long way, because that feels like an industry norm, but it actually is not. More often than not, guests will just go on and they won't cross promote. And the podcast host might leave a little frustrated or not, depending on their goals. But that's something that you can do to really stand out and become a repeat guest, or just get goodwill. If you want to be relationship building, be explicit about that part of it, I think.
Yes. Well, and the other thing is, why wouldn't you want to promote it? Because part of, as an author, being a guest on a podcast is also increasing your visibility and credibility. So if you share that on your platforms, what you're doing, and this is what I love about podcasts, Betsy, you and I were talking about this before. What I love about a podcast is once it's done, that's one conversation you had that can reach hundreds, thousands of people without you having to have the conversation again. So instead of you continuing to talk about your book, you're able to then share on your social platforms, hey, by the way, I was recently on this cool podcast. Should you be interested in this unique aspect of what my book is, or what my message is, or whatever, take a listen. So it becomes a visibility strategy for you as well. So to me, it's silly when people don't always do it. So I do like how you said that's not industry standard. Y'all listen in, do it. It will go a long, long way. The other thing, and Betsy, I think you brought this up, I love it, is come to the table prepared. Like, think of a couple of things that you want to share so that you aren't wallowing around going, oh my gosh, what is I supposed to talk about? Like, a couple of things. Don't have it too scripted out, because the beautiful thing about podcasting is it's conversational, but you do want to make sure that you have something where you're prepared with a couple key bullets to walk away from.
Yeah, I think that really it helps calm the nerves a little bit too. I know when I'm guesting, I mean, I have hosted hundreds of podcast episodes, and we still work off a framework every week. I work off an outline. And when I guest with someone else, I always have, even if it's just handwritten notes, I have a few things that I know I'm going to say, or if I have had, sometimes the guests, depending on who it is, or the host will send you some questions in advance. And I always take those and I think, what's a little story I could tell? Yeah. What's an anecdote I have that's a story that I know well and that I know resonates with people? Because we all have those, if you're going on and you're making the rounds. And even if it's something you feel like you've said 100 times, it's one of your like classic stories, this is a new audience. They have not heard it.
Yes.
Like, make sure when you have those little anecdotes and the stories and the answers and a couple of just things to jog your memory as you're going down, it's so helpful because you might think that you know all that off the top of your head, and then you could get a little flustered, and it helps to have that as a little cheat sheet while you're going through the interview.
And people connect to stories. People
Mhm.
connect to stories. So just spouting out the content, or these are the 3 things you need to do, and this is what my book says. I kind of consider these as for authors as little Easter eggs, right? So when someone picks up your book and they're reading your book and they get excited about your book, all they know about you is what you've shared in the book. But a podcast gives you the opportunity to share a little bit more. Maybe you share a little bit about the writing process, or about a story you didn't include in there, or about a new thing that happened since the book came out, or about a reader that was impacted by your book. Those types of things people get excited about, and they're like, oh, and then they can go tell people, did you know that this author, and then they feel cool because they have that Easter egg. So definitely, I love when you mentioned to have some stories and things ready, because people connect with people. People don't connect with things, they connect with people. People will buy books because of people. I'm a prime example as an author myself, but beyond that, and even beyond the fact that I help other authors, I buy, like, there's a certain number of authors, I will buy any and all their books before I ever like read what it's about, because I am a loyalist to that author and I follow them and I love them, right? And that's something beautiful here in our author space. Another thing to consider too, I think, when you're pitching yourself, have a kind of podcast pitching or promotion kit ready. So this should include like your bio, like what you said, a couple of things that you might want to cover, a description of your book. Maybe it's a high resolution book stack, your social media handles, your website, your headshot. If you have that kind of packaged up, I like to have it on the website. So I have a speaker resource page on my website. So I can easily just say, hey, yes, everything you need is here, should you need it, even an intro on how to introduce me. That makes it easy for the podcast host. But if you don't have a place on your website, you can easily pull that together in a Word document or PDF, something that just gives the host something so they don't have to go digging. But those are the things they're going to want. They're going to want to know how people can continue the conversation, and they're going to likely create some social graphics and need those things to go with it. I think, Betsy, before we pivot to the last of the 3 things we're talking about today, I do want to acknowledge you need to also consider how are you going to capitalize on this podcast opportunity by hopefully gathering those people who are learning who you are and loving your message and pulling them over to your website, or to your podcast, or to purchase your book. And that is called an opt-in or a lead magnet. So do you have something like that? Do you even know what those words mean? Does it make your head spin? Don't worry, Betsy and I have a whole podcast on opt-ins, lead magnets, email nurture campaigns, that you can listen into. But it's really important to be thinking about that, and maybe having like an offer or a freebie or a downloadable or something that you can say on the podcast. Like, I think, Betsy, on your podcast, let's just say I was a cookbook author, I would want to come to the table with a really special recipe that I don't have anywhere else, that I would say, oh, you all might really like this. Go here and have a special recipe for your people that you can download, that gets people in your funnel and you can continue that conversation.
Yeah, that's so smart. No one does that.
People take it up.
I will say, for the most part, that's such an afterthought.
Yeah.
And so then, which is funny, because if you listen to podcasts, you know that the host almost always asks, where can we find you? If people want to keep following, they always ask, because you want your audience to get value. And if that's someone who's bringing value that they want, you want to direct them to good resources, because that enhances your authority in the space, right? And so it helps when people be like, well, you can buy my books wherever books are sold. And that is really not the best way to convert people off of a podcast into your own community, because they will sort of forget, and there's nothing hooky about it, kind of like what you were saying, where you'd be like, oh, that's so interesting. Let me go get that, recipe. And if you link it back
Yep.
to a story that you tell or something, I mean, that
Right?
makes,
I need to write a cookbook because I like that idea. I'm gonna
I
do
know
it.
you could have an amazing podcast tour with that cookbook. Yeah. I mean, if you do it really strategically,
Yeah.
there's a way to make it super powerful. And then there's a way to show up and kind of fumble through it and tell people to buy your books wherever books are sold. And then podcasting's not really going to work for you as well.
Yep. Well, I think you're giving the listeners too much credit. You're thinking about this as even a TV interview where someone's at home possibly sitting down and can take notes. Most podcast listeners are not. They're on the move. For them to remember to do something, it has to be impactful and something that they need to do, like where they will stop right now and do something. And that actually, Betsy, takes us to number 3, because you and I have talked, and this is a big turning point for why I started a podcast. Most podcast listeners are more likely to stay within the podcast platform for continued engagement than to get off. So I'm proof of this. Even if you didn't tell me this is truth, I'm proof of it. I'm listening to a podcast. There's a guest on it I really like. They go, "Oh, I have a podcast. Check me out." I will pause the podcast, go find them, add them to my library to listen to later, and then I can continue the conversation without having to get off the podcast platform.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is really that, like, closing the loop.
Yeah.
Circle there. And this is a kind of a marketing concept I've been thinking about a lot this week, which is people don't like an open loop, right? So if you are wanting to close the loop with that person where you're like, whoa, I do want to know more from this person. I want to go, like, I want to close this loop because I want the rest of this information. What is the easiest, most, frictionless way to do that? And in podcasting, it is to then introduce them to another podcast, your own.
And that takes us to number 3. How do you leverage your own podcast? I am not a believer in movement without strategy. I don't think everybody should raise their hand and say, I should start a podcast. There's things to consider and things to, think about. However, I do think as authors, we are given a beautiful opportunity in today's world and in the less noisy and cluttered space of information sharing, where we can leverage podcasts to build an affinity, build a relationship, create engagement, help people feel like they know, love, and trust and support us before they even pick up our book and or during and after. So I'm kind of a big fan of this for certain people at certain times. And, the episode or the season 1 of the Empowered Author podcast talks about all different ways on how you can leverage a podcast as an author in really creative and innovative ways. So I'll definitely make sure we're linking to that. And I was going to say in the show notes, but that's what you say when you're in a podcast, in the description of this video. I'm getting used to saying the show notes. But as authors, I do think you should pause, take a step back, and ask yourself a couple of questions as to if a podcast is a smart marketing strategy for you. And I would specifically start, how can a podcast help me with brand awareness and bigger than that? I'll use my podcast as an example, the Empowered Author podcast, which is really meant to align with my business, which is meant to help authors. But there are very, very few book marketing podcasts out there. It's weird, Betsy. It was weird. We were pulling it together. Remember, I'm like, there's not that many.
Yeah.
So if someone goes on the platform and is looking for that, they're likely to find me. Whereas if they go online and Google book marketing ideas, there's a lot of people who have opinions on that there. So you do have a more kind of niche, audience already. And same thing with, what you're talking about. It's just, there's some stat we used in, on our podcast where it talks about how many blogs to how many media outlets to how many podcasts exist in the world. And it's like, for every one, don't quote me on this, Betsy, but I remember it was something like for every 750 blogs, there's like one podcast. So something along those lines where it's like the competition's just it's not as big. So it will increase your brand awareness and help you not just if somebody stumbles on it, but now you're building relationships with people. It's not, podcast really isn't one-sided. Like I feel very much in relationship with the people that I'm listening to.
Yeah. It is, we get that a lot too with the dinner sisters, because people will say, oh, I feel like your third sister. I feel like this connection to you. And I think that really happens when you are using your own voice and people can hear your voice. And it just is a wonderful way to extend and deepen that brand. And especially if you're someone who knows you need to produce some more content around this book and around the offering. And a lot of us these days feel like we should be producing more content because there are more platforms to be on and there's just different things to do. And I think that's where you can think critically about what feels enjoyable to you.
Yes.
Are you a verbal communicator? Are you someone who likes to talk through things? And I think when I'm talking to people who I'm working with as clients, that really comes up a lot is it's people who are kind of tired of writing. Like there's a woman who's a copywriter that I'm working with, that just started working with, and writes copy 8-10 hours a day. And she knows that she needs to produce her own content for her own content marketing and her own digital marketing strategy for her business. And she's like, look, I cannot write anymore. Like
Please don't make me.
yes, like I would love if I can just talk through some of this stuff because it's a break for my brain. And so when we're thinking about marketing strategies, sometimes we need to think about what personally feels good and fun and just is something that we can do that doesn't feel so heavy,
Absolutely. And I also think that, we need to think about a content strategy and repurposing content. So we will do an empowered author workshop. I believe I have it scheduled in December where we talk about content strategy planning for next year. But a little tidbit here. You can repurpose lots of content. You don't have to be recreating new content in every way every day. And I like podcasts as kind of the start of your content trickle down. So you could record a podcast. You could use a tool like Rev or something else where it pulls out and transcribes that for you. Then not only are you promoting the podcast for those who are audio listeners or audio learners, but you then can take that transcript and listen, authors, I'm right when I say this. It is so much easier to edit than it is to write. So you have your transcript and you're like, oh, I can edit that down into a blog. You can even link your blog to the podcast. You can pull social content from the podcast quotes. You can then use your podcast. This is something I like to do, and leverage it in conversations with people as they start connecting with you. You can use the podcast as a way to pitch yourself to be on other podcasts so that they can hear you. They know your voice, they know your message, your tone, your energy, all of that stuff. Like you can be really strategic in how you're using this, and all you're doing is recording it once. It's kind of cool, Betsy. Like that's what sold me, I think.
Yeah, it is definitely a great way to kind of build a nice foundation base of evergreen content that can then kind of cascade down.
Yes. I was sharing with you, when I hit some of the milestones in my podcast. And by the way, the world needs to know Betsy's my podcast editor, y'all. So we are like, we go deep into all of this. So she knows all the inner workings of the Empowered Author podcast. But as you've seen kind of my podcast hit these different milestones on the back end, when it hit, I remember when it was 100 people and I called you, I was like, that podcast got 100 downloads. And you said something that was so it just made me feel really good. And you said, Stephanie, that's 100 conversations you didn't have to have. Like that one piece of content reached 100 downloads. So it could have been the same people, but in essence, 100 times that conversation you may have had to have in the past, you don't have to. And it's in a very non-threatening way. So if you are an author who doesn't like selling your book or you get uncomfortable, this is a way to do that. This is a way to do it without that uncomfortable feeling of how many books do you want to purchase? Are you ready? You could do it in a much different way that feels really great. Betsy, I know that our podcast season talks a lot about this. So let's just run through like a couple of really cool ideas on how authors can use podcasts in the process. So I know you had no idea about book launches and all of that stuff, but I'm a big believer that you could use a podcast to help with an internal book launch team or even external kind of book launching to the masses. You can even use it as a tool for your internal team, and you could even hide it, put it on a platform, a podcast hosting. What is it called? Where you put it, what is Buzzsprout? What do we call that? We place it on
hosting. Yeah, you're hosting.
yeah, you can do it on a like a hidden host or an invisible host or whatever that's called, where the rest of the world doesn't know that it's out there, but a select few people do. And that's kind of special for launch teams. What are some other ways that you think authors could use podcasts in their marketing strategies?
Yeah, we had so much fun.
That was my favorite episode.
I know all the different ways, because there really are really unique things that are out there right now where you can do a private podcast feed, you can do a public podcast feed, you could do 6 episodes with featuring people who appear in your book, right? If it's like nonfiction and you've written about case studies or things like that, which would be really neat, some behind the scenes. We talked about a QR code that you could put on your book jacket, and maybe that's a way that you help lead a mastermind or a book club through your like key takeaways or the themes of your book. There's a lot that you can do that doesn't need to be just a weekly episode where you're interviewing people, because I think that feels hard to start for people. And if you think about how can I use this platform, like Stephanie said, to reach 100, 500, 1,000 more people, and maybe how can I make this evergreen or make it something that can be applicable throughout this launch or for 18 months or for 2 years. And one thing we had talked about too, which I thought was really neat, was I had a friend who made a yoga sequence for people who were not able to attend that week in her in-person studio. So you could always go through, and it was the same 6 episodes, and she never really updated it because it didn't need to be, it was just the cues for you. You could go through the cues for 20 minutes and it would cue you through a whole class. And that was just for her participants if they went on vacation. And she just did that. So it was a resource for them. And we had talked about people who have maybe something where you have a meditation or affirmations or things like that, where people who are reading your book could get something like that from you in a podcast way that they can kind of go back to when they need that in their life, which I thought was so cool.
You need to think about, there's so many authors out there nowadays, and anybody can publish something. I hate to say that, but they can. And so how do you cut through the clutter and be someone that sticks out? What is something that you can provide that someone goes, oh my gosh, that's so cool. Now I know this author and I, am a super fan for them. So absolutely, I encourage people, listen to the 6 episodes of season 1 of the Empowered Author podcast, which makes sense. It was so relevant that we start the podcast by talking about how you can use podcasts, where you can get more info from Betsy and I on kind of innovative ways on how you could leverage your own podcast. And then, of course, just know you're welcome to take that and run with it, or you're also welcome to invite Betsy and myself into the conversation to help you come up with a strategy and help you execute upon it. We're here kind of at your fingertips. So Betsy, we are kind of at the end part of today's workshop, but I do want to see if we have any questions coming in on the chat, and let's kind of run through a handful of those if you still have a few minutes.
Sure.
All right. So one of the questions I'm seeing is, how many podcasts should I try to be a guest on? This is a really good question, especially for authors who are on the verge of launching their book. I'll share my ideas and then Betsy chime in for sure. From a perspective of what it takes to kind of accurately and adequately prepare to be a podcast guest, I would say about 1 podcast a week as a guest is like you're doing good. Like that feels good to me. Some people that I work with, maybe twice a month as being podcast guests is ideal. When you're coming up to launching the book, you might find that you are on a couple more podcasts than 1 a week. But if you feel like being a podcast guest is a smart marketing strategy and visibility strategy for you, I would say my recommendation would be the goal of try to book yourself for one podcast a week. Let's just see if you can do it. And if you fall short and you get 1 to 2 a month, you're still sitting in a really good place. Would you agree, Betsy, or you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect amount, because you want to, like we covered before, make sure those are going to be valuable for you too. You don't want to just be going for like sheer quantity, because if you do one really strategically researched and pitched and you're on there, that
Right.
that could really move the needle more than, getting on a whole bunch of podcasts and maybe they're not quite as relevant.
Yeah, and I think too, if you're doing what we recommended, where you're helping to promote it on your channels, let's say you got on 10 that month, and then you promote all these 10 podcasts on your channels, your people are going to get tired of it too.
Yes.
So there's a fine line of being visible and being too visible. And I think, one a week is probably ideal. All right, this is a good question, Betsy. I think, you might have some great insights on it. So someone might want to be hosting their own podcast. What types of things should they consider when they're thinking about creating their own, like maybe even from like a technical standpoint, like what equipment do they need, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to know is that you don't need a whole lot of equipment, which is great. You need a plug-in USB mic that will make your sound night and day better than just using your
Absolutely.
computer, and you can get one of those for between $50 and $100. There's a lot of great ones out in the market, and I think most serious editors who are not overly prescriptive will just say, choose the mic that gets you podcasting and go with that, because in that price range, they're probably all, just find one that works and is available at your Best Buy or on Amazon. And then you need your computer, and then you'll be just recording into somewhere. So if it's like a lot of people record their podcast on Zoom. Stephanie and I use Riverside.fm, which is a great double ender. It looks exactly like Zoom, but it records both people in there. And it's great. So you'll just need the computer, the microphone, and what you're going to record onto
That's it.
to start
And
out really.
yeah, and maybe a closet.
Yeah. And a nice quiet space.
A nice quiet space. We were talking about this earlier about how one day we both would love to have a soundproof room. Until for now, unless I'm on video, you will enjoy my podcast while I close myself in a closet. And, that was fun. Or I did recently, I don't know, Betsy, if I told you this, you may have seen, I posted the photo on social. I gave myself a CEO weekend, which is so much fun. And every business owner and author and entrepreneur needs one of these. But I went away for 2 nights, 30 minutes from the house, and stayed in a extended stay hotel and did some work. And I decided to record some of my podcasts there. And I found, this is so funny, I went into the closet that they had with a little curtain, and it was lovely. I had honestly some of my best audio has come from there, Betsy.
Isn't that funny? So I will tell you, we were just talking about this too before I got on, and really just heavy curtains or recording somewhere where there's like something that will absorb the sound.
Yes.
So you would not believe the number of people who have asked me if it's a good idea to record in their bathroom. And I think they're thinking because it's a small space. So the reason why we're recording in the closet is not because this closet is small. It's because it's filled with clothes and maybe carpeting and all that stuff is absorbing. So your bathroom, same size as the closet maybe, but it's got like tile and mirror, and the sound will bounce all over the place. And that's probably the worst place in your house to record. And your car is the same way. So a lot of people feel like your car would be a good place to record because it's quiet maybe, but that glass and everything else, that's going to really impact your sound quality. So don't record in your car or in your bathroom.
Mm-mm. The only other thing I thought of, and this is something, if you were to collaborate with Betsy and I or any other kind of podcasting support service, is you probably also want to figure out some music to go with your podcast. And it's interesting how music can shape the whole thing, and can also kind of be a time suck if you go searching for some music. So, collaborating with someone who has music at their fingertips is always really smart. Or I actually have a great friend of mine who can create podcast music for you if you want to get like special like that. But outside of that, we were also talking before today's workshop about good is better than perfect. And if you wait too long to do perfect, you've missed out on all of these people that could be following you if you would have just put out good.
Yeah, that is a really good point. I mean, I think equipment wise, it's definitely what you need. And then structure wise, just make a plan for yourself and like an outline for the episodes, and then an idea of what maybe your first 4, 5, 6 episodes might look like would get you started. And it is really the difference. This is like, I was telling Stephanie that I was talking to an audio engineer who'd spent 30 years in radio, and he was telling me that they podcast audio. People are really used to what they were considering podcast audio, which is kind of like a home studio sound, right? And you're going to get that from even really big shows like Joe Rogan and Tim Ferriss, and they have that home studio podcast sound, and that's the expectation. And he was saying the difference between that home studio sound and like a radio production high end, that really smooth radio sound is $35,000 worth of equipment. And he said, especially these days when people love the authenticity of podcasts, where people are speaking just from their heart where they are, that you're connecting with real people. And also that people know that people are so used to Zoom.
They are.
Just it has shifted the perspective on audio. So don't let that stand in your way.
Don't let it stand in your way. I'm reading a book right now that's called Soundtracks, and it's about the stories we tell ourselves. Don't let yourself be the reason that you don't do something that you need to do. And that makes sense. But also don't just do it because everyone says to do it. Make sure it's strategic and makes sense in your marketing strategy. Betsy, I'm sure if other people have questions, they can send us notes, and I know you and I would be happy to answer them. You can comment on this video, and we'll circle back with you and share our answers to that too. However, if you are interested in learning more, I wanted to share with you, you are welcome to schedule a complimentary 15-minute chat with us here at the emPowered PR Group, where we can figure out if it makes sense for us to help you in your podcasting approach or other marketing initiatives. And there will also be you'll also want to make sure that you're following the Empowered Author Podcast. You can go to the empoweredauthorpodcast.com and get information there, so you'll want to be up to date on kind of the unique marketing strategies. Make a note too, these workshops happen once a month. They're complimentary to any nonfiction author out there. So if you found this beneficial, we would love for you to share this video with other people so that they can learn more and figure out how to really be an empowered author. But we would love for you to also stay connected with us here at the emPowered PR Group, so that you can be aware of future podcasts and future author webinars. Goodness, how many times can I say empower in one word? Betsy, thanks so much for joining today. And for everybody else who has tuned in and here live and virtually, we appreciate you all too. Listen, I feel like I should sign out this one in the way I sign out my podcasts, right, Betsy? It's like,
I think you should.
how does it go? I believe that empowered people empower people. Betsy and I have empowered you. Now listen, y'all, go empower others. Thanks for joining.